Hello and welcome back to the second video on syntax in our series on the Avestan language. In this video, I'm going to introduce you to some of the basic features of that subsection of Avestan syntax, which can broadly be defined as predication. More precisely, we will be looking at the topics argument realization, subject-verb agreement, as well as voice and valency. Avestan is a language with nominative-accusative alignment, in which the first argument of a verb, the subject, is marked by the nominative case. With certain exceptions, direct objects are canonically realized by the accusative, and indirect objects by the dative case, as can be seen from a simple sentence like this. Haumo aibio savare barshaiti. Haumo gives barshaiti them aibio savare force, where the subject haumo is realized by a nominative case, the direct object savare by accusative, and the indirect object aibio by the dative case. There's also some evidence for non-canonical forms of subject marking, as we will see on the next slide. In late, or perhaps rather faultily transmitted texts, we occasionally find apparent accusative subjects. The example quoted here is taken from a description of a purification ritual, which involves a series of holes that have been dug in the ground. In course of the ritual, the person to be purified successively proceeds from one hole to the other. The example is Paurim upamarem, at the first hole, the man, narem, becomes Bhavaiti, free of Nasu. In Zoroastrianism, Nasu is the concept and also the demon of putrefaction, one main source of impurity. Based on the assumption that such accusative subjects, like narem in the sentence, represent a linguistic reality, it has been argued that they particularly correlate with intransitivity or low transitivity and non-volitional events, like in this case, the man becomes free of Nasu without contributing to it himself. The occasional use of genitive subjects, as in the other example on the slide, is probably derived from a partitive reading of the genitive case. Urvaranom paiti zemada usurcienti. Plants, urvaranom, but here marked with the genitive case, grow upwards, usurcienti, on the or from the earth, paiti zemada. Here the use of the genitive plural as the subject of usurcienti, they grow upwards, may imply a meaning such as certain kinds of plants or a number of plants. That's why we perhaps get the genitive here. Some particular verbs also induce non-canonical forms of object marking. For instance, the verbs rich, to abandon, and char, to celebrate, praise, regularly take genitive objects. Examples are yo iririchaite gai thanom, who wishes to abandon, iririchaite, gai thanom, the herds. But the herds is not marked by accusative here, as we would perhaps expect, but by the genitive case. Similarly, Fshusha, the cattle winner, char keremahi, we celebrate. And here we see that the verb for to celebrate takes a genitive object as well, Fshusha. Other verbs take two accusative objects, representing different semantic roles. An interesting case is the verb sa, which means to leave someone when used with a single accusative object. But when used with two accusative objects, the meaning shifts from to leave someone to rob someone of something. The example here is yo mom tat trauno sinat, who yo robs me, zinat, or robs me, mom, of this share, tat drauno. Maybe the original construction or underlying this double accusative here would have meant something like, who leaves me behind concerning this share. The agent in passive clauses is commonly marked with the instrumental case. Let's look at this example. Sachware, ja, sie waberesoi, dai vaischa, mashiaischa. The utterances, we're not quite sure what that word means, but I translate it as utterances here. Sachware, which, yeah, have been done, vaveresoi, by gods and men. Dai vaischa, mashiaischa. And dai vaish and mashiais represent instrumental plural forms of the nouns for God and man. As mentioned before, subject-object alignment in Avestan is overwhelmingly of the nominative accusative type. Yet in light of a trend towards ergativity in the past tense in later Iranian languages, it is a matter of debate whether certain passages in Avestan should be interpreted as anticipating such a development. For example, one could argue that a sentence like I'm moi ida visto, this one, in the nominative, I'm, found, visto, again in nominative, by me, moi, or of me. One could argue that such a sentence which includes a verbal adjective in ta, acting as its predicate, simply means I found this one, not this one has been found by me. Note here that against the ordinary rule, the agent in this passive construction is not marked by the instrumental, as in ordinary passive clauses, but by the genitive or genitive dative by the genitive dative of the first singular personal pronoun. Another example, this time from Young Avestan, is this one, again involving a verbal adjective in ta and a pronominal agent. Jesi cha he anya arashiausna fravarshta. And if Jesi cha, other evil deeds, anya arashiausna, have been committed, fravarshta, by him. He. Or should we rather translate, if he has committed? In other words, do the genitive dative marking of the agent, he, and the nominative marking of the patient, anya ara shiauthna, do they in fact represent the marking of an ergative and absolutive case within a system of ergative alignment in the past tense? In most cases, nothing speaks against reading such a construction, not as a simple past, but as a sort of periphrastic passive of the perfect, especially when the resultative character of the construction is obvious. Since otherwise, there's ample evidence for nominative accusative alignment also in past tense, the situation found in Avestan may at the most represent the starting point for split ergativity of the later Iranian type. Next, we shall discuss some issues regarding the way subjects agree with verbs in Avestan. In general, verbs and their subjects agree in number and person. This also applies to dual subjects, which usually do agree with dual verbs both in Old Avestan and Young Avestan. Thus, in a verse from the Gathas, we find the nominative dual of mainyu, spirit or mental impulse, agreeing with jasaitem, the third person dual present injunctive form of the verb hemgam, to come together. Let's look at the example here. Hiat ta hem mein yuja saitem, and when hiat, the two spirits, mein yu, or the two kinds of mental impulse, depending on how you want to translate this noun, when they come together, a third person dual form of the verb. Two coordinated singular nouns also take a dual verb, as in the second Young Avestan example on the slide. Mairemcha varemcha yate kirpem varshayato. Fog and rain, mairemcha varemcha, which make grow varshayato, your body, te kirpem. And here varshayato is a dual verb agreeing with mairemcha varemcha, or more precisely, it is in fact the dual relative pronoun ya, which agrees with mairemcha varemcha, and the relative pronoun then itself agrees with the verb. Other than in Old Avestan, in Young Avestan we also find mismatches between dual subjects and plural verbs, as in dua nara us sayenti, two, dua, nara, man, or men in the dual, us sayenti, are born, but this time with a plural ending. So we get the mismatch between the plural verb and the dual subject. A famous type of number mismatch in Avestan is that between neuter plural subjects and singular predicates, always so in Old Avestan and less regularly also in Young Avestan. This mismatch is believed to reflect the origin of the neuter plural from an earlier collective category. Look at these two examples. Sachware, ja, vaveresoi, dai vaischa, mashiaischa. We have met the first example before when looking at the realization of agents in passive clauses. Here, the neuter plural sachware, utterances, we are not, as I said, we are not entirely sure what it means, goes with the third person singular perfect form vaveresoi, have been done, representing this typical Old Avestan mismatch. In Young Avestan, as exemplified by the second example, we encounter the same phenomenon. Virsiatoncha, ida vuhu vastria, and let good pastoral works, vuhu vastria, good pastoral works, let them be done, let them be produced here, virsiatom, again with a singular verb, agreeing or actually not agreeing with the plural neuter subject. In our third video on Avestan morphology, when we looked at the different sets of endings which appear in the verbal system, I briefly mentioned that each set exists in two different variants, active and middle. I also mentioned that the functional difference that comes with this formal distinction is primarily one of voice. But I did not talk about how this distinction of voice actually emerges in the texts. For the sake of this presentation, it makes sense to treat the active as the default voice and point out the different uses of the middle in opposition to the active. So here are some frequent types of relation a verb with middle inflection can have to its active counterpart. Typical oppositions of that sort include the one between an active verb, a verb with a transitive verb in active inflection, like weiner, to see, which with middle inflection, here indicated by M, turns into a passive, to be seen. We also get middles with a self-benefactive function. For example, pacha means to cook when used in the active, but to cook for oneself when used in the middle. Other verbs show reflexive meaning when inflected with middle endings. Thus, frasnaya means to wash in the active, but to wash one's own hands, to wash oneself, with middle endings. Finally, middle forms may also be reciprocal. For example, purisa in the active means to ask, but in the middle it means to take counsel with someone. For a number of verbs, a confrontation of middle and active is not possible because they are so-called media tantum verbs. That means they are used with middle endings only. They include intransitive verbs such as as, sit, just like transitive ones such as yasa, to sacrifice to or to worship a deity. Transitive media tantum verbs are sometimes also called deponents. We have seen that with some transitive verbs the middle is used as a passive. In addition to that, two other devices are available in Avestan to produce the passive of a given transitive verb. One, which is only available in the present stem system, is the formation of a distinct passive stem with help of the suffix ya. This stem itself is then inflected with middle endings and in Young Avestan occasionally also with active endings. The second device, a distinct passive ending e, is available in the aorist, present and perfect stem. However, its scope is also limited because it has explicit past tense value and is moreover restricted to the third person singular. You can see an example built from each of the three aspect stems here. The aorist stem through to here has a third singular passive sravi, has become renowned, has been heard. The present stem irenau, to set in motion, has a third singular passive past irenavi, was set in motion, and the perfect stem ad, to say, has a third singular passive past id, was said. Besides the formation of a passive stem with the suffix ya, a valency decreasing operation, a derivational device with valency increasing function also exists. I'm talking about the formation of a causative present stem in aya. Present stems in aya, which stand beside another present stem belonging to the same root, often exhibit an increase in valency in comparison to that of the other available stem. As here illustrated by the example rauchaya, to make shine, which stands beside another present stem of the same root, raucha, to shine. In this case, therefore, the aya stem can be regarded as a causative stem formed to the other stem, the simpler stem raucha, to shine. An interesting feature of causatives in Avestan is the fact that when a root shows both a transitive and an intransitive reading depending on the voice, active or middle, the causative relies on the intransitive reading. The verb through, for instance, means to hear in the active and to be heard in the middle. The causative sravaya consequently does not mean to make someone hear, but to make something heard, and eventually to recite, to sing. And this concludes our second video on morphosyntactic structures in Avestan. Please join me again for the following video in which we will look at the Avestan clause.